This week on Conservative Crossroads, should the Senate confirm Attorney General nominee Todd Blanche? Mike Fragoso says yes. Andrew McCarthy says no. The confirmation of Todd Blanche, coming up on Conservative Crossroads now. Welcome back to Conservative Crossroads, the program where conservatives lean into their differences rather than deny them. I'm Henry Olson, Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy, and your host for this program. This week, we'll be talking about the nomination of Todd Blanche to become permanent Attorney General of the United States. That's controversial because, in part, of Mr. Blanche's prior role as President Trump's personal attorney prior to the time when he was sent back to the White House after the 2024 election. Arguing in favor of Mr. Blanche's confirmation is Mike Fragoso, a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Arguing against the confirmation is Andrew McCarthy, former prosecutor, Southern District of New York. Each person will have 5 minutes to make opening statements, followed by 40 minutes of mutual question and answering. We will then have 2 minutes in reverse order to have closing statements ending our discussion. Because this is a clear yes-no debate topic or discussion topic, I've asked that Mike start off by arguing why Blanche should be confirmed. Mike, you're up.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks for having me on. Thanks, Andy, for joining me to have this discussion. It's obviously very timely. So I'm here to support the idea that Todd Blanche should be confirmed by the United States Senate to be Attorney General of the United States. And I think it's a question of sort of how a Republican senator should think about this. First, question of background. Todd Blanche is obviously currently the acting Attorney General of the United States. He was confirmed as DAG, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, last year. His background is perfectly normal. He clerked for Joe Bianco and Denny Chin in the New York District Courts. He was an AUSA in the most prestigious and persistently troublesome district of the United States, Southern District of New York. He was a supervisory AUSA there. He has white-collar experience at Cadwalader and Davis Polk. In other words, he's not Matt Gaetz. So he clears that threshold. Then you have to deal with the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is, in a tough position these days. That's sort of to be expected in a Trump administration. The guy simply doesn't like the usual way that the Department of Justice works. He doesn't like being told no by his lawyers. He doesn't really have any time for the idea of sort of DOJ independence, which I don't necessarily disagree with. He thinks with some justification that the department spent 8 years in the business of ruining his life. So you have a president that doesn't like the department. DOJ in many ways compounded this problem. It was in many ways a well-intentioned project, but at the department, they set up incentives a year or so ago that pushed out all these sort of experienced and competent senior lawyers who know how to follow orders and keep lower-level careers in line. They're not there anymore for the most part. And so the anti-bureaucratic chemo killed off a lot of functioning organs over at the department. So those are the challenges it faces. Nevertheless, I think with those challenges in place, the department under Blanche's stewardship has been doing very good work. A majority of Senate Republicans presumably want the Department of Justice to do Republican things. And that is what it has been doing. The urban murder rate is probably the lowest it's been since 1990. It's ground zero, the Department of Justice, for making sure that immigration reforms actually happen. It's been doing that effectively, especially given the judicial resistance they've faced. The border simply isn't a problem anymore, and the DOJ side of the enforcement picture is a big part of that. Just today, they got 2 big immigration wins at the Supreme Court. The department's doing great work while being understaffed to help achieve energy dominance under Blanche's leadership. They've been very active against climate lawfare. They filed great briefs in the Plaquemines Parish case and the Suncor case at the Supreme Court. They preemptively sued states like Hawaii and Michigan for their lawfare schemes, and they're getting involved elsewhere throughout the country. Judicial resistance that they faced has been off the charts, as I mentioned. Nevertheless, DOJ has, as I understand it, a 56% win rate for getting stays in the courts of appeals. If you include the Supreme Court, after they've lost at the Court of Appeals, it's up to 63%. When you consider that, these lawsuits were all brought in pretty far left districts, that really gets you somewhere. So they're fighting reverse discrimination DEI very effectively. They're doing great work on judicial nominations. In other words, the vast majority of what the department is doing, they are doing well. And this is the sort of thing that Republican senators want. So if you're a Republican senator, the question you need to ask is, Blanche compared to what? That's when I was working for Leader McConnell. Judge Mukasey told me once, that's the most important question you always have to ask. I think he's right. You're not going to get a Bill Barr or a Mike Mukasey waiting in the wings to save them from Blanche, even if they don't like some of the stuff that the department is doing, such as the Obama-Biden style weaponization fund or some of the prosecutions that they've been up to. The fact of the matter is that the president will get somebody who's going to be doing that 1% of things that they don't like, one way or the other. He now knows how to run the department, how to get his person in the department. What do you do about that other 99% that the Republicans in the Senate support? I think that Blanche has shown that he's very good at that other 99% and would continue to be very good at doing that other 99%. And so since Republican senators can't stop that 1% with this vote on Todd Blanche, they should focus on that 99% and having the Department of Justice in capable, steady hands. And I think that's what Blanche would provide.
Andy, you're up.
Well, there's a lot that Mike said that I agree with in terms of what we would expect out of a good Justice Department. And I have to say, I applaud the emphasis on violent crime. When I was a prosecutor, first in the early 1980s, one of the important things that Rudy Giuliani brought to the Southern District of New York, very much encouraged by the Reagan administration, was to prioritize what the federal government could bring to bear on what was the most important problem in New York, and actually nationally, what was at the time the most important problem, which was violent crime. I think Mike is completely right about the need to prioritize immigration enforcement, and I applaud the Justice Department for doing that. I applaud a number of things that they've done to the extent that it would be what one would expect from a normal Republican-led Justice Department. Where I part company is, I think, in two places. One, I think Mike's percentages of the good versus the bad are a little bit skewed. To say that 99% of what the Justice Department is doing is just peachy, and there's this teeny tiny 1% that's just a little bit alarming, I don't think is a fair representation of what's happened here. We've had a Justice Department from day one of this administration, and Blanche has been a leader in implementing this, who basically have had the mission of discrediting everything that was done under the Biden administration and discrediting the prosecutions of Trump, even to the extent that they involved serious misconduct, and just dismissing them as if they were nothing. The Justice Department has weaponized its processes against the president's enemies in a very public, notorious, and unabashed way. I think I was probably as vehement a critic as there was of the lawfare that was practiced under the Obama administration and under the Biden administration. And I'm simply not going to take a different position because we now have a Republican administration. Moreover, what I would say about that is, at least with respect to Obama and Biden, when they practiced lawfare, they had the good taste to pretend that they weren't doing it. And it was dishonest, and it was disingenuous, and it was condemnable in many ways. But at least they understood that it was wrong, and therefore they had to veil it as if it wasn't actually happening. In what we have in this administration is not only lawfare, but the president wants you to know that it's lawfare and that he's coming for his enemies between the eyes. And as a top official in the Justice Department, you have a choice. You can either be the one who tries to stop that and honorably resign if you can't, or you can aid and abet it. Todd Blanche has chosen to aid and abet it. It does my heart no good to say that. I came into or when the administration came in, I actually was quite happy to see that Blanche had been placed in an important spot. I don't think it's a big deal as long as he follows the conflict of interest protocols. I don't think it's a big deal that Blanche was the president's personal lawyer. And I thought that the asset that he would bring to the equation was that Pam Bondi, who I also had hoped for at the beginning, was a novice when it came to the Justice Department, which is a very insular institution compared to other government institutions and even other prosecutorial institutions across the country. And I thought that somebody who wasn't familiar with the department and who didn't know where all the levers were would be aided greatly by somebody like Todd, who has experience with the Justice Department. It just hasn't worked out the way that I hoped it would work out. I'd say one final thing, since my time is winding down. I do agree with Mike that the question does come down to what does a senator think about all this? How should a senator think about his role? I think the Senate has an obligation to discipline the Justice Department, to discipline the executive when it acts lawlessly. And we're not going to impeach the president, but these kinds of appointments are an opportunity to try to bend the administration into lawful conduct.
Thank you, Andy. Who wants to start with the questioning?
Andy, I've got a question for you on that last point, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I take your point that you see this as a way to discipline the White House. I guess perhaps coming from my time in the Senate, how does it discipline him if he's going to get what he wants one way or the other, right? So if Blanche doesn't get confirmed, he'll stay as Attorney General, most likely, potentially for the duration of the administration, unless President Trump decides that he wants, Ed Martin there instead or something. What practical consequence in terms of disciplining the administration does this have?
Mike, I think that we've seen a number of occasions over the last 18 months or close to 2 years, whatever it's been, where when the administration gets blowback, it actually does amend its behavior. And I agree with your overarching point that futile gestures are to be avoided because they're just a waste of time and they don't advance the ball up the field. I wrote a book about impeachment back in 2014.
Well,
And the argument that I made in the book, which I think is equally relevant here, is that whether you have impeachable offenses or not, or whether you should proceed on impeachable offenses or not, comes down to two things. One is the seriousness, the egregious nature of the misconduct. And while, I appreciate the old Gerald Ford observation that an impeachable offense is whatever the House of Representatives decides an impeachable offense is, I think that we can objectively say that there are certain abuses of power which rise to the level of something that's impeachable. But the other consideration that has to be taken into account is the likelihood of removal of the president. And to my mind, if you don't have a political case where you get support for removing a president that would cut across partisan lines and ideological lines, then it's a mistake to start the machinery of impeachment in the first place, because it takes the country in a dark place and to no good end, because at the end, you not only don't get the president removed, you probably encourage him in his lawlessness by having tried to take a shot at him and missed. So I'm not insensitive to your point that you want to avoid things that actually won't work in terms of addressing misconduct. But there are a range of things that the Senate can do and that Congress can do short of impeachment and that it should do when there are abuses of power. And I think if you tell the president that we're not going to fill these positions, there's a good chance that he'll change his behavior. It will never be perfect because Trump is Trump. But I simply don't accept the proposition that because Trump is lawless, you were more diplomatic about it. I'll just say what I think it is. I think using the Justice Department as an offensive weapon against one's political enemies is a lawless thing to do. And it's an impeachable thing to do. I think that the corrective here for that is to take the opportunities that Congress does have and that the Senate does have with things that they can accomplish that have a chance to bend that behavior into something that's more lawful. And I think if you tell the president, we're not going to fill your positions, we're not going to confirm your nominees, you at least have a chance of bending him into lawful behavior. It doesn't mean it'll work. It may not work. On the other hand, I think lawfare is probably the reason that Trump is in office to begin with, and there's a political consequence to this that gets carried along as well. And I anticipate that largely because of the way the Justice Department has abused its power over the last 18 months, this is going to be a major issue in the election to come. And I don't think the public likes lawfare. Again, I think Trump is president because the public doesn't like lawfare. And they're not going to like it anymore when it's committed by Trump in a way that's very unabashed and open and notorious, almost to the point where you're just convinced that he absolutely wants his enemies to know he's coming for them. And that part of the reason I can't get comfortable with Todd as Attorney General is if I'm a senator and I vote to appoint him at this point, on this record, it's like I'm endorsing the behavior that's gone on for the last 18 months. And I don't see how a senator can do that.
I guess my concern to the initial point is I just don't see evidence that stopping this would actually change Trump's behavior. Because I think at the end of the day, he wants people in these roles that he thinks will do what he wants to do. Yep. And the prestige of whether this person is Senate confirmed, I think that would actually provide some protections to Blanche in terms of breathing room, because if after Blanche is Senate confirmed, the president tries to get rid of him, he will have people in his ear saying, it's a real pain in the neck to get a new person that has to go through the Senate. It might temper the president's desire to fire him in the future. But as a general matter, I think he just wants somebody there who will do it. But to your point about how the Senate has been able to push back, I agree they have, and I think they've been right to do it. But when they've done it, they have been able to detect actual leverage points that move the president, right? So the Jay Powell prosecutions, Tom Tillis concluded he's on the banking committee, and he wanted Warsh to be chairman of the Federal Reserve, but he told the president, if he's going to get my vote, you got to stop that prosecution, and eventually did it. With the weaponization fund, they eventually, it was a little touch and go in terms of the ICE funding, but that is something the administration desperately needed. And so I take your point, and I think I agree with you that when the president is exceeding his authority in the view of Congress, they should push back on it, and they should use the tools that they have. I think you just have to calibrate those tools to the desired end. And I just don't see any real reason to think that this is something that would actually affect the president's behavior. Whereas there are specific discrete actions where I have no doubt that going forward for the rest of the year, Tom Tillis and John Cornyn are going to be, looking to see if they have pressure points to stop things that they think are particularly egregious.
Let me just say that I read your piece, particularly the point that you made. You've written twice on this for National Review. I don't know if you've written elsewhere that I haven't caught up with it, but I read your point about Tillis and the effect that it had on folding the investigation of the Fed and particularly the chairman of the Fed. And I emphatically agree with that. I think it's very important to have that that the tactic that the Senate uses to try to bend the executive's misbehavior is commensurate with what the misbehavior is, and is designed to cure it in a way, and is designed in a way that you had an example, I think, of Vance saying
Yep.
he was putting a hold on all of the
All U.S. attorneys.
the
He
all
blocked
U.S.
US
attorney
attorneys.
appointments in order to stop the lawfare against Trump, and that was a mismatch between the tactic and the ambition of the tactic. It was also a problem in that the Biden Justice Department denied that it was involved in anything so low as lawfare. Can you imagine?
Of course not. About
So
this.
so their position about it was different, but I do think that we're not talking about blocking every confirmation. We're talking about blocking an attorney general confirmation. I'm not persuaded by your contention that that removal, that people would be in Trump's ear about like how easy or hard it would be to remove a new attorney general, because Trump has already removed the attorney general. He had Pam Bondi in. He moved her out because, precisely from what we can gather, I think there was a lot to do with the mishandling of Epstein. But I also think we know from the paper trail that Trump was not unhappy with the way that the lawfare prosecutions were going. There was some that he wanted that she didn't move on, and there was some that they did move on when she was there that were such preposterous cases. One was thrown out, or I guess two were thrown out. Comey and James were thrown out because the person that Trump installed to bring the cases, after the career prosecutor told him that there was no case and didn't want to proceed, he brought in somebody who was under the statute not qualified, not because she was personally not qualified, but because they had already run their time under the acting provision. But again, that's the kind of thing the Justice Department should have known. The cases themselves were preposterous. The way that they were brought were preposterous. But the reason they were brought was because the boss wanted them brought. And he was very clear with Bondi about that. And then when Bondi got moved out, the first thing that Todd did was indict Comey on what I think is one of the most preposterous cases I've ever seen. There's not a chance that case is going to get to trial. So, I think Trump has already moved out an attorney general. He thinks it was pretty easy to do. You mentioned in some of the stuff that you've written that if Todd gets the job, he's going to have to be looking over his shoulder because this one or that one might try to supplant him. I think we've seen for 18 months to 2 years or whatever it is that Blanche's incentive is to do what Trump tells him to do. I don't see how that's going to change one way or the other, whether he's the acting attorney general or whether he gets certified as the full-fledged attorney general. I just don't see it changing.
So I think there's probably a subtle difference between Blanche and Bondi on that last point, in that my strong suspicion is that Blanche doesn't part of the problem with Bondi is that she was taking orders directly from the president that he accidentally put on Twitter once, remember? Because he didn't think she was doing it enough. I think Blanche has avoided a lot of that by simply using his relationship with the president to sort of understand what the president wants and sort of affirmatively go ahead with that, maybe not necessarily at the president's direction, which there are problems with it insofar as those things aren't great. But at the same time, it's, if anything, a little bit closer to the old Democrat-style lawfare hypocrisy, right? Where we're not having I don't think with Blanche you have the spectacle of the president telling him, you have to go prosecute these people. Much like how Merrick Garland understood who he was supposed to prosecute. I think Blanche is more sufficiently sophisticated to see that and know that. Now, I agree with you. I don't love that. I didn't like it at all when the Democrats did it. I don't like it when Republicans do it. I don't really see a solution to the bigger problem, which is something we can discuss. that's an issue. But I think that makes him a little bit different from Bondi in that regard. And again, I do think that is a very small percentage of what the department's actually up to. As to Bondi, yes, the president did get rid of her. She lasted a decent while. She also had problems that I think Blanche doesn't seem to have, where everything I had heard was that part of why she was so embattled is a problem that is kind of unique to this administration, whereby lots of people have the president's phone number. And if she wasn't doing what he wanted, there were people in the building who would call him and say, you know, the attorney general isn't doing what I want her to do. And I don't see that as much happening with Blanche. I mean, reading the papers, it seems like something like that probably happened with Ed Martin on the weaponization working group, which I know National Review wrote about, which I have a slightly different take on it. It always struck me as a bit of a rubber room in which to put the people that the president wanted to be doing this weaponization stuff so that they're not really infecting real ODAG behavior. And even that, it seems, was not sufficient for Martin, who, again, according to reports, was complaining about how Blanche wasn't going after the president's enemies enough. And he wound up getting shifted out of there and put in the DC USAO or whatever. So it seems that was a problem that Bondi had that it seems Blanche has a better handle on, which is a good thing. As to the breathing room of being an actual U.S. attorney, I think part of my thinking here is also probably just colored by my time in the last administration. I was there for Sessions, Whitaker, and Barr, and they were all very well-meaning, good public servants, and they all had a very different time of it. With Sessions, he meant very, very well. I think he was a great senator. He was a great attorney general in a lot of ways, but he didn't have the ear of the president. He didn't have the confidence of the president, and because of that, it was like working like in a fort that was under siege at all times. We'd be relying on, Rod Rosenstein's eerily canny ability to play Celebrity Apprentice with people in the White House to be able to get the department out of messes. Because again, Sessions always loved the president, but the president didn't love him, and it was a real problem. And so that goes to why I think it's important to have somebody in that position, for better or worse, who has the ear and respect of the president, which Todd seems to have. And then with Whitaker, again, he was a good guy. He had really great people around him. Like some of my favorite folks I worked with in the department were in his front office, but it was highly chaotic. He didn't have the support of the Senate, and they made it very clear. He didn't necessarily have full control of the department. There was a lot of backbiting and a lot of just chaos within the building that when Barr showed up, it was a breath of fresh air, because here's a guy who has the confidence of the president, the confidence of the Senate, and knows his business in terms of running the department. And so my worry is if you have Blanche there as a perennial acting, where then you also have some sort of combination of perennial DAGs, you wind up in a sort of perpetual Whitaker-like situation, which just isn't good for the department. Whereas if you actually confirm Blanche, ideally also confirm a DAG, you wind up giving them more of a chance to be more Barr-like, even if, again, it's not going to be Barr, it's not going to be Mukasey. And I think there's real downstream danger of that if I were a senator, I'd be considering. And you hinted to some of it, Andy, with the business of the U.S. attorneys, right, where the statutory scheme for these U.S. attorneys, and we've, I think, gone back a little bit and disagreed on some of the constitutional issues there, but putting that aside, it's extraordinarily complex and very easy to run afoul of it. It's also, in some ways, easy to get the person that you want there. But you have to be crossing your T's and dotting your I's. Otherwise, you're going to wind up getting a bunch of convictions thrown out, essentially. We ran into this at DHS last time, where the senior leadership of the department by the end of the administration was all individuals performing the duties of blank, right? So you had Chad Wolf performing, I'm not even sure if he was acting secretary. He was performing the duties of the acting secretary. Ken Cuccinelli was performing the duties of the deputy. Chad Mizell, I don't remember if he was Senate confirmed GC. I think he might have been acting GC. It was just actings up and down. To the extent that I was doing nominations on the Judiciary Committee and getting calls from friends of mine at DHS saying, can you please stop doing some of these judges in the lame duck? We need to get Chad Wolf confirmed because otherwise all of our regs are going to get thrown out. And we were just like, we're losing power in 2 months. We're getting all the judges we can get done. But their concern wasn't wrong. They wound up getting a whole bunch of regs thrown out because when you have actings up and down the org chart, it can be pretty easy to run afoul of the Vacancies Reform Act. And then all you need is, the right case in front of Judge Chuckton or whatever, and a lot of stuff winds up getting thrown out. So I think there is a real, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but by 2028, absolutely, governance concern that if I were a Senate Republican would really worry me about having just actings running this whole show.
Yeah, I hear all that. I just don't think that the problem here is structural in terms of actings versus actually full-fledged Senate-confirmed appointees. I think the problem is President Trump. I mean, he's a chaotic person. And when the history that you just charted out with respect to Sessions and Whitaker and Barr, and I appreciate that you were there and I wasn't, but I do know those guys and I am quite familiar with the history. And I don't think, the reason that the president didn't trust Sessions was over one decision. I agree with you that other than that, Sessions, I would say including that, Sessions was a fabulous attorney general. I think he was very loyal to a strong, solid law enforcement agenda. He was a very good attorney general to Trump, but he recused himself from Russiagate. And to my, as I said at the time when he did this, I thought his recusal was too sweeping. And I thought that he maybe paid too much credence to the people in the Justice Department
who were giving
staff. The career staff who was giving.
At the end of the day, it was his decision.
Yeah, but I do think that it wasn't that he was under siege. He was under siege for a very particular reason, which was politically explosive. And when Whitaker came in, it wasn't that the Democrats were opposed to him because he was an acting or he didn't have the full array of power. It was that they thought that what Trump did to Sessions was wrong, and they decided that they were going to give a hard time to whoever Trump put in. I don't think it was personal.
It wasn't. It was Republicans who just didn't like the way that Trump went about putting him in as acting.
Right.
Some didn't like what he did to Sessions, like Ben Sasse was a staunch Sessions defender. Others, like Senator Graham, I don't think really cared one way or the other what he was doing to Sessions. And so there was just, I think, a lot of befuddlement and confusion as to why Trump was doing this. And I think that's also why they put pressure on Trump to actually get somebody to do the job long term, which doing well.
Let me ask you this then. Because I don't think this is happenstance. I think this is a plan. Am I wrong to say that Trump, before he was even in office in the second term, was beginning to float schemes for how he would get around the appointments clause and the need to get Senate confirmation, and trying to figure out how he could either provoke recesses, so he could try to do recess appointments in the kind of fugazi way that Obama did it, and otherwise has been trying to put in people and strain as far as he could strain the Replacements Act and the provisions. It's at 546 and the other provisions of law that we talk about a million times, whether the president is trying to put an acting in or trying to put somebody who's an interim in. They have extended those about as far as you could extend them, precisely to avoid Senate confirmation. And isn't that a large part of the reason that you get to the point where you have actings all over the place? It's not that I think the problem here is the way the president has gone about this and has been so adamant that he has to have people he personally trusts in these positions, whether or not he thinks they can get confirmed. And the reason that we have actings all over the place is not. I mean, look, maybe there's slow walking by the Democrats. That's what they do. That's politics. I get that, but a lot of this isn't it true that a lot of this has to do with the president actually trying to subvert the process of confirmation?
I think that's probably right. I mean, I think it goes to part of why I don't think refusing to confirm Blanche would actually really do much to get the president's thinking to change. I don't think he necessarily puts a ton of credence in why it matters to get these people Senate confirmed. Again, I do think on the back end, you could get in his ear about why it's just a pain in the neck to have to do it again. But I think you're right that he seems to have come in with an eye towards trying to avoid this. I remember, what was it, November 2024, where he got going on recess appointments. And
Right.
I want to say, was it Paoletta put out a big paper about why recess appointments are totally constitutional and totally legitimate. And I remember it was this day that McConnell got an award from AEI, and Dorr asked him about it because it was in the news. And he's like, yeah, we're not doing that. So I think he has had that attitude. Frankly, I expected going in that I've been hearing rumors that they were thinking just actings everywhere, all times, whenever. Those were the rumors I had been hearing. And so I was actually a little surprised at the extent to which they really went through the Senate process. In the end, Thune, I think, confirmed record numbers of people in his first year and wound up coming up with a whole system by which to avoid Democrat obstruction on sort of lower level nominees. So they actually are confirming a lot of people in the end. And so I think it's fair to say that they came in with an idea of how can we avoid sort of responding to the Senate and our personnel decisions, but practically speaking, walked back a lot of that when they actually came into power to actually get Senate confirmation. They have gotten Senate confirmation for a lot of people. I think you want to run into trouble with U.S. attorneys because you have the blue slip. And that's one where, again, there are a host of different ways where you can avoid Senate confirmation and actually still have your person run that office.
But you run out of time.
Yeah, I think that they've actually figured it out in L.A. What's his name? Izzelli. Billy Izzelli out there. He has a very, very, very sharp appellate counsel in his office, who I think is one of the reasons why he's one of the few who has actually been able to stay in office as a perennial Fauza, essentially. But as I understand it, he's also happy being a perennial Fauza as long as he's in charge of his office. For whatever reason, I think some of these folks out east really wanted the title for some reason. So I think there's probably a way that Alina Habba could still be a perennial Fauza in New Jersey, but it seems like she didn't want that. It seems like Lindsay Halligan didn't want that. And so instead they come up with these extraordinarily Byzantine ways of doing it. And
but Todd wants it. You know, I mean, that's the way this works. They want the title. We're having this discussion because Todd isn't content to be acting. He wants to be the full-fledged Attorney General. That's the way this goes. Let me ask you something else. One of the things I thought was really disturbing about one of the more disturbing things I think Blanche has done, which is his role in the settlement of the IRS case, Trump's personal suit against the IRS, which we're still, I understand that that's still rolling around in the court. And is it Judge Brinkema?
Yes, Judge Brinkema has it. Yeah, they're going back and forth with Brinkema on it.
Right. So, but one of the things I thought was disturbing is that, to the background to this is I have thought from the beginning of the administration that one of the purposes of this weaponization working group, and a lot of what their messaging has been from the beginning, is to discredit the investigations that were done against Trump, to cast them as if they were completely fake and based on absolutely no misconduct, just sheer lawfare woven out of nothing. And I was a big critic of Jack Smith's Capitol riot investigation. I don't think there's any question that the Justice Department would have had. It was absolutely legitimate for the Justice Department to investigate the Capitol riot and Trump's role in it. I do think the way that it played out, that they were trying basically to use a criminal investigation with no eye toward whether the president had any immunity or not and was actually practically prosecutable under the circumstances. I think they did use that as a proxy for a failed impeachment, which failed mainly because I thought the Democrat-led Congress in 2021 went about it in a very politicized and incompetent way. And then they tried to use the Jack Smith prosecution of that as a kind of both a cleanup operation and, to the extent that investigation, I think, was lawfare, it was because it was governed by the political calendar. But I don't think that means that the underlying misconduct was not misconduct. Whether or not it was criminal is a different matter. The Mar-a-Lago case, I think, was clearly based on criminal conduct and would, in fact, have resulted in a conviction if Smith hadn't overcharged it. I think that, any of us who have actually prosecuted a case that involves classified information, where, the Classified Information Procedures Act kicks in, and you basically have to have a pretrial trial of the trial where the court makes all kinds of rulings about whether, the evidence the prosecutor wants to put in is admissible, what the defense wants to put in is admissible. They're very hard cases to get to trial. They can't get to trial in anything like what the normal track would be for a normal case. And if Smith had indicted that as just a simple obstruction of the grand jury case, he would have had a chance to get that to trial. And it was serious misconduct because there was significant evidence that Trump had lied to the FBI about whether he was hoarding documents or not. Now, I'm not saying he's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He never got a trial, and he didn't get a trial in the other case either. But I don't think either of them was based on frivolity or was based on, it was just lawfare through and through. For example, I thought that the Bragg prosecution in New York was lawfare through and through. That wasn't a crime. They essentially made something up and labeled it as a crime and got a very compliant judge who helped them along the way. And I think with respect to the civil prosecution of Trump by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, that was also I don't want to say it was a made-up case because I think there's a lot of evidence that Trump did exaggerate his assets, but it was an unprecedented case in that she took a consumer protection statute and applied it in a situation that it had no application in, where you were dealing with sophisticated financial actors on both sides whose whole business was to appraise risk. So I think that case was nonsense. The New York cases are nonsense to the extent Trump says that it was all fake, phony lawfare. I'm with him, but I don't think that the Jack Smith cases are based on nothing. And the reason I raise it in the context of Blanche's role in the settlement is that in the actual settlement papers in Trump's suit with the IRS, there are references that are made to Smith's cases as if they were completely made up fraudulent cases. And I kind of find it, having been at the Justice Department for a very long time, I find it astonishing to see the upper tier of the Justice Department just label two major investigations by the Justice Department as if they were completely fraudulent, when it seems to me that there was significant misconduct that the Justice Department had every reason to investigate.
Yeah, I guess I just probably don't see eye to eye about how legitimate those investigations were. I agree that they're more serious than the New York ones, which were fugazi, as you said earlier. But I think with the Jack Smith investigations, there's, I think, a couple underlying issues. One is that if you're looking to prosecute the former president of the United States, that is just, as a matter of tradition in this country, very, very, very unusual. It's the kind of thing that happens in, like, Brazil, right? It's a sort of Latin American construct of how you treat people who are out of office. And so does that mean that they, are immune to the law? No, but it means I think you have to be pretty serious about what you're going after them for. I don't think with the January 6th investigation, I didn't see it as being a particularly good use of the department's time, given that high threshold, given how far away it was from the acts in question, right? That issue had been litigated politically in terms of the impeachment. There was the, select committee that looked at it forever. According to the reports, the Biden administration was kind of frustrated that Garland wasn't moving fast enough on it. And then Garland eventually did move on it. And he appointed Jack Smith, which I think is sort of another issue. I'm, generally of the view, I don't know, I can't remember if you've written on this or not, but something like that, like, again, it's just sort of further DOJ independence hypocrisy to give it off to Jack Smith and say, like, this is, an independent prosecutor is looking at this case that we know everybody from the president on down to the DAG desperately wants. He should take ownership for it and done it himself.
Yeah, let me agree with you again on that. I did write about this at the time. Okay. I didn't think his appointment was compliant with the special counsel regulations. I didn't think there was a conflict of interest. The Biden Justice Department had been investigating for about 18 months or more when Smith was appointed. The idea that they couldn't was ridiculous. The reason he was appointed was exactly what you suggest, which is to try to pretend that Biden didn't have anything to do with exactly what Biden was doing, which was having his opponent in the next election subjected to a criminal investigation. I agree with all that. I even agree that if it was my call, my exercise of discretion, I would have exercised discretion to not indict Trump. I'm not saying that I thought this was a proper use of the Justice Department's time. I think that, again, I thought the Capitol riot case or the January 6th case was a proxy for a failed, incompetent impeachment. And as far as the Mar-a-Lago case is concerned, I thought there was very serious misconduct, but I also think that, there's a lot of people who've committed similar misconduct at the...
So I think that's what I run into with Mar-a-Lago is, to your point, if you're going to do that and do it right, it's extraordinarily complex. It's going to take forever. And so maybe they overcharge. You should have just done something like obstruction of the grand jury. I guess I get very queasy at sort of doing process charges against a former president. You've got, Bill Clinton committed perjury. He got disbarred for it. He's a lawyer. As a lawyer, he has independent obligations from his role as president or whatever. And so he faced sanction for that, and that seems entirely appropriate. But the kind of, classic process charge thing that, federal prosecutors love to use, using that against a former president, I don't love. I think there are a lot of complexities when you're dealing, I don't buy, obviously he declassified it with his mind argument, that certain friends of mine make. I don't buy that, of course, but I do think it does get a little complicated, having had to deal with a fair amount of PRA issues over the years, leaving aside its constitutionality, which OLC recently opined on that it's not constitutional. And I've been surprised since then to find how many sort of very serious conservative mainstream people agree with that. But putting that aside, it gets complicated when you're dealing with the president, because classification, who owns the records, things like that are a function of the executive. And right. It gets tricky when you're dealing with former executives. Republicans tend to have a pretty broad view about historically what former executives get to claim, while Democrats do not. I think, frankly, for lawfare purposes, George W. Bush promulgated regs that obviously former presidents have full control over their records because his dad was going to keep control of his records. And then as soon as Obama comes in, like, absolutely not, we're not doing that. I get to control what that war criminal George Bush keeps, right? And so that winds up being, again, kind of complicated as a practical constitutional matter. And so I just don't think it necessarily meets the threshold of what a prosecutor should be doing. Now, as to it being in the weaponization IRS proposed settlement, I mean, in an ideal world, Blanche did more for the president on all of that with the immunity decision at the Supreme Court than any of this will do. And it would be great if the president simply recognized that and let this other stuff slide. But, that's simply not who he is. And in terms of the sort of practical question at hand, it's just not, if I were a Republican senator, I don't think it's the sort of backward-looking thing that I would be too concerned about when casting a vote about essentially what will the Department of Justice look like for the next 2.5 years.
Yeah, I just think that if an imperative of the Justice Department is to whitewash the seriousness of the underlying conduct, as opposed to whether it was a prudent exercise of discretion to bring the cases, I agree that it wasn't a prudent exercise of discretion to bring the cases, certainly as they were charged. I probably have a different view of it if Smith had brought a more narrow case, because while I agree with you that indicting a president or a former president is the kind of thing that you expect out of third world countries. We don't want our country to go in that direction. The incentive that it creates for the next party when it comes in to do the same sort of thing is too high and ruinous. And for that reason, I don't think that those cases were prudently brought. But I might feel differently about it if it was just narrowly about obstructing the grand jury, which I think happened when Trump was out of office and after he had been given a number of opportunities to provide or to return the documents. And also, if he thought that those documents were his and all the arguments that people we both know and like have made in his behalf were valid arguments, he could have marched into federal court and said, quash the subpoena, those are my documents. And instead, he misled the FBI and the grand jury. At least that's what the evidence suggests. So I might feel differently about it if Smith had brought a narrow case. I still think it would be a close call on whether you exercise discretion, given what the prior history and this sort of stuff is. But I do think it's a terrible mistake for the Justice Department to contend that two things that were absolutely legitimate for the Justice Department to look into and that did uncover misconduct, whether it was a criminal misconduct is a different story. But for the Justice Department to treat that as if it was just complete fake and completely fake and phony, I just think is a terrible mistake. And it's the kind of thing I would imagine that can make for some difficult questions for Blanche to answer at his confirmation hearings.
Do you think that's that different in theory, just thinking about it now, from, say, when Biden took over? There were a number of cases, public charge comes to mind, where the Garland Justice Department didn't, change the rule or anything like that. They just marched into court and said, yeah, the plaintiffs, we agree with the national injunction you put on this rule. Plaintiffs win. They started, and Trump's doing it now in Texas, but they started this business of regulation by essentially acquiescence to national injunction.
Right.
That, I mean, conceptually, that's saying what this DOJ policy was unlawful. We agree this was unlawful. And therefore, the La Raza or whoever wins. It seems that it's not that unusual for one, administration's DOJ to cast aspersion on a previous administration DOJ activity. And I think that seems like one sort of, just again, thinking about it now, public example that I think is basically doing the same thing.
Yeah, I agree with you that there are situations where often for policy-driven reasons, I guess always for policy-driven reasons, one Justice Department will countermand what another Justice Department has done and be very critical of it. I think this is very different because this is not merely a change of policy. This is taking behavior that was bad behavior and acting either like it didn't happen or that it was fine. And under circumstances, to have a situation where the Justice Department is taking that position with respect to Trump and then throwing the book at Bolton, or having a case against Comey that accuses him of calling for the murder of the president on the kind of nonsense that is in that indictment. I don't see how they can. I mean, it's so hyper political to take such different positions with respect to a case that actually did involve very serious misconduct. And then these other cases, which, I mean, we all know that if Bolton had written a book that was complimentary of Trump, there's no way he gets prosecuted for mishandling classified information. We all know that if
start
Comey,
under Biden, though?
Yeah. No, I'm not saying there's no case
No,
against.
I mean the Bolton investigation. I thought it was Biden's U.S. Attorney Office that started looking into that one.
It's got a strange history, which we probably don't have time to get into. But the book review happened under Trump, and then there was an investigation that kind of bridged into Biden, and then it got dropped, but it got picked up again when the new Trump administration came in. My only point is that I think if you're going to take the position that the conduct that Trump was investigated for was unserious, which I don't think is true, it's very odd to be taking the kind of position that they're taking in these cases against Trump's enemies. And I don't know how he's going to be able to justify that.
I need to jump in because we are now out of time. Thank you very much for a very enlightening and informative discussion. We'll now move to closing statements. Andy, you're up. 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Henry. And also thanks to Mike, because I think I have so much respect for him and enjoy his work, but also I think a conversation like this demonstrates that we actually have a lot of common ground and want a lot of the same things, even if we're not united on the bottom line. I think if I could get a Justice Department run by Mike Fragoso, I'd be quite happy with that. I do think it comes down to what we discussed at the beginning, which is you have to make an assessment of what you think the role of Congress is and what you think the role of the Senate is in this posture. I can't comfortably take the position that we should accept as a given that President Trump is going to be lawless, and therefore what the job of the Senate is to try to get somebody in there who might make him marginally less lawless. I think the job of the Senate is to say that we're not going to tolerate the kind of behavior that we're getting out of this Justice Department, and to the extent that we have the power to address it, we're not going to give you your nominees, particularly a nominee who has been there through all of the misconduct. And maybe he's fought off some of it. There are reports that Blanche has stopped some of the more, I don't want to say crazy, but at least, the more irregular things that Trump wanted done, and that some people who are his minions in the Justice Department were willing to do. There are reports that Blanche pushed back on a lot of that. But the fact of the matter is he's part and parcel of most of it. And I guess if I agreed with Mike that what we were talking about was 1% of the work of the Justice Department, and that it wasn't a very, I don't want to put words in Mike's mouth because I don't think he said this, but the impression that it's not a very important 1% when you think about the greater scheme of things and how well the Justice Department is otherwise pursuing a strong law and order agenda. I must say, I just can't see it that way. I don't think it's just 1%. I think it's the quantum of lawlessness that has gone on and the seriousness of it and the unabashed nature of it is something I don't think that the Senate can in good conscience look the other way about. And I don't think their job is to try to make the Justice Department work a little bit better, accepting the fact that the president is just going to be lawless and we have to deal with that as a given and try to work it out as best we can. I think it's the Senate's job to respond to that and to not take actions that appear to have the Republican Senate endorsing the Justice Department being abused in this fashion. So I wish I could take a different position. I really had high hopes for Todd Blanche. As I said, I hope that because of his federal experience, his sovereign district of New York experience, that he would be a real asset to Pam Bondi and that the Justice Department wouldn't go in this direction. I really hoped that he would prioritize the institution over the president's demands. I think a strong attorney general or deputy attorney general is supposed to convince the president when he's doing something that's lawless or outside of a norm, why the norm is important and why the law is important to uphold. And I've been very disappointed in his performance in that regard, and I wouldn't be able to confirm him.
Mike, final word is yours.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me, and it was great talking to you. I really enjoyed that. At the end of the day, I think the issues that cause heartburn with Blanche really are a very small percentage of what the Department of Justice is doing at any given time. The responsibilities of the department are vast. They're sweeping. And I think, again, in the vast majority of cases, they are doing it well under challenging circumstances. We read about some of the, stuff that the president is demanding that the department does and that Andy doesn't like and that I, for the most part, don't like either. But we don't necessarily read about the other side of it. And so I think there are benefits to having someone, and there have been benefits to having someone in Blanche's position that has the president's trust that we might not necessarily see. So, for example, the Supreme Court win rate of the Solicitor General's office is staggeringly high. As of earlier this year, it was at like 90% when the court actually reached a decision. A big part of that is that the president trusts Blanche and he trusts Sauer, as his former lawyers, to tell him what cases to take and what cases not to. If it were up to the president, I'm sure they'd take up everything. And it would be terrible for the law, it would be terrible for the department, it'd be terrible for the country. But because they have the president's trust, they're able to tell him, no, trust us to pick our battles. We know how to pick these ones and win. And they've been doing it. And so I think that is probably playing out in all sorts of other areas of the department that we don't necessarily see. And I think Blanche is in the ideal position to keep doing that because of the trust that the president has in him. And so at the end of the day, if you're a Republican senator, the question isn't really about Blanche, it's about the Department of Justice and how to best steward the Department of Justice given the realities of President Trump, given the realities of the nature of Senate leverage and things like that. And so I think you've got three choices. You can oppose Blanche to send a message while he stays in his current position, which is essentially expending capital for no real practical benefit. It's what, McConnell calls make a point, not a law. You can oppose Blanche with an eye towards getting an alternative. Senate Republicans should really not like that because they will not like whatever is in door number 2. It's probably beyond their imagination. Or third, which is where I fall, you can support Blanche, recognizing that because Trump is the president and all that entails, Blanche is the best guy available for running the Department of Justice for the next 2.5 years.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Andy. And thank you, listeners. Please join me again in 2 weeks for another episode of Conservative Crossroads. Take care.